Nevertheless, she persisted. On this day, when we hear, along with other Christians who follow the same Revised Common Lectionary, or the 3-year cycle of readings in the Bible, we hear about this persistent woman seeking justice, and I'm reminded of that call to be sturdy and steady today, as much as we can be, and to surround ourselves with like-hearted, like-minded, like-spirited people. I have to admit, whenever I hear this particular reading from the Gospel of Luke, I get it mixed up with another story from the Gospel of Luke, when similarly, someone went to someone else's house and was knocking on the door and would not take no for an answer. The other story isn't a woman going to the house of a judge, but it's a person going to the house of a friend, and they're knocking on the door because this friend had another friend arrive at their house and they didn't have any bread. And so they went to the third friend and asked if they could have some bread to be hospitable and to serve to their company that they had. Similarly, the person on the other side of the door did not want to get up, did not want to come to the door and to do what was being asked of them. We don't have the background story, but sometimes people have other things going on, or they're tired, or they're grumpy, or they're somehow otherwise indisposed. But eventually, that person did come forward for some bread, and they said it was because the person kept asking. So both stories are similar in that there's a focus on persistence and on looking for something that is needed, on satisfying a hunger or a thirst or a cry out for justice. And so persistence can be difficult. You saw an example today of me trying to be persistent and consistent. I did have an idea earlier that I would just use the cover of the boxes. I should have gone with that idea. But persistence is sometimes very difficult to have when you're alone, or if you feel like it's only about you and the moment in front of you. Persistence has been an important thing in my life and in the work that I do. A team approach, understanding that none of us can be at something 24/7, 365. That we have to be in community, and sometimes we have to share the responsibilities to give each other space, to give each other respite, to allow that door not to be opened for a while, and to get that kind of rest and refreshment that is needed. I worked in a locked inpatient psychiatric facility the year between undergraduate school and seminary. And I remember several times being forced to stay when my shift ended because you have to have someone there to care for the people. And so there's a sense of being in a team and on a team, but not being able to do all of it all the time. And it's important for us to remember that. We here at Parkway have an Easter vigil. It's a 36-hour prayer vigil that begins at the end of our Good Friday worship service and ends as we begin our sunrise service on Easter morning in the cemetery across the street. One person at least takes one of those 36 hours so that together we're holding that vigil, but none of us is doing it alone. And it's good to feel during that time that others in the congregation are carrying that with us and for us. I recently joined a board of an organization called Access Missouri about reproductive justice, and a number of clergy, interfaith clergy, are a part of it, and we take turns offering the opening prayer when the gathering happens, knowing that we can't all be there every time, but knowing together as a group we are committed, and one person takes on the responsibility at the time to keep up that persistence and consistency and to keep that movement going. And so I like to imagine each of us standing with the widow at the door, or standing with the friend at the door as they knock, as that widow is seeking justice. Probably didn't have a lot of power and privilege in her life, and so she was trying to find someone who could speak up for her or with her or encourage her to have a voice. And then the friend who was there at the door looking for bread to help another friend. So it wasn't just for them, but it was for someone else. And so I imagine us standing with that widow who by herself was looking for justice, and then standing with the friend who was there on behalf of someone else who was hungry and who was traveling and who needed to receive the gift of hospitality. So along with that widow, along with the friend, I come with the psalmist. Psalm 119 says a lot of things about following in God's ways. And one particular line speaks to me in this moment when it says, I do not turn away from your ordinances. I do not turn away from your ordinances, because God teaches us these ordinances. God shows us these ordinances through Jesus, and then God gives us the skills and the equipping through the Holy Spirit to live out these ordinances. So what is an ordinance, right? So a definition in the dictionary is that an ordinance is an authoritative order or a decree or a piece of legislation that's centered by a municipal authority. So an ordinance might be something smaller. It's not a global law, but it's something local. So an example might be a leash law, or something about recycling, or something about smoking. And in faith circles, ordinances might be a particular thing that your tradition follows. It might fall within the dream and vision and hopes that God has for all people, but because it's an ordinance, it's particular or peculiar to that tradition or to that particular setting. So a more traditional understanding of ordinances might be that they're tight. A traditional understanding of ordinances might be that it can only happen and only be real and only be successful if it's done in a particular way. It's something to be obeyed or else. That there's no salvation, there's no real relationship with God unless you do this thing, unless you follow this ordinance completely. It's a ritual observance that doesn't have much flexibility and doesn't have much change in form or format or frequency, but it has to be done in a particular way. A more progressive understanding of ordinances are that they are to be lived, and we are to let the Holy Spirit breathe in the midst of those ordinances and that vision of God for us as a community and as faithful people in the world, and that these ordinances are not particularly defined always. They're acts of justice or acts of hospitality or acts of feeding people. And so we don't know exactly when we go into each day or each context or each season how it is that we would follow that ordinance, because the situation changes, our context changes. We change as we move through life. The people that we meet, the people that come up to us, the people that we find may cause us to move outside of what we've understood to be the parameters and the format and the frequency of being engaged in this work. And so for us, in the United Church of Christ, we tend not to hold tightly to prescribed ways that ordinances must be followed. But we feel like we're trying to be flexible and available to the moment and understand that the things that are being asked of us today might be very different from the things that were asked of us yesterday, the things that may be asked of us tomorrow. But we hold on to the idea that we're living this vision, trying to be the individuals and be communities that the Holy wants and needs us to be at the moment. And we have some familiarity with some things that we do because we have put certain things in place that we can look at and look to and find encouragement and grounding and wings in doing. And so we talk in our denomination about having two sacraments, and sacraments are outward and visible signs of the grace of God. Sacraments where we do a certain thing, maybe say certain words to lift up the presence of God and to recognize that God is the one doing the acting, that it's not about us and if we do things right or in the right order, but we're saying, look what God is doing, look what God has done, look what God envisions for us as individuals and as a people. It's those moments where the Holy breaks in to the things that we kind of set up and breaks in ways that maybe we didn't expect. And so in our denomination, we have two sacraments. We talk about baptism and communion. And the UCC likes to say if there were a third sacrament, it would be foot washing. I know you're relieved. The two sacraments of baptism or communion are given to us because they're things that Jesus did, and they're things that Jesus told us to do. And so it's not quite an ordinance because it's not all detailed, but he said to feed people and to take and eat and remember. He said to bless people and fulfill our promises to each other, to build community and to honor and help people to belong. And so a traditional view of baptism might be that you must be baptized in order to be saved. Or if you are not baptized, something horrible could happen to you. In our tradition, because it's an ordinance, because it's something particular and peculiar to us as a denomination, as a congregation, we like to say that boundaries are not drawn because of baptism. That if someone was baptized in another tradition, we don't say, we're going to redo it right. We honor that people come with a faith story and a faith her story or history, and we honor and cherish that and welcome them. And we don't say that people must be baptized, because what it is, it's a recognition of something that God has already done. And so if we don't stand up in this place, if we don't pour water and enact it and enliven it, it's still real. It's still something that God did. It's still something that God does to love us and honor us, to help us to belong, to help us know that we matter, that we're cherished, that the Holy meets us every day of our lives, is deep within us and all around us, is in yesterday and today and in tomorrow. And so we have movement and flexibility. It may be an infant, it may be a young adult, it might be an older adult that might come to be baptized. It's for that idea of inclusion and celebrating this thing that God has done. It doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to look a certain way. It just is a recognition and celebration of God's love. And similarly, with communion, some traditions like to say that communion must happen in a certain way at a certain time. There are certain prerequisites that you must have before you can receive communion. There's a sense of some communities have a closed communion. It's not an open table, but you have to already be known by that community. You have to have said or done something very particular in order to be included in that sacrament, in that meal, in that expression of God's love. We talk all the time about our table being an open table. It's lovely that it's on wheels and it moves because we recognize in our particular tradition that it's really not us doing something, but we are passing along from God welcome and nurture and encouragement. And we're meeting people where they are, and we're doing what Jesus said over and over again. He fed people. There were miracles around feeding people. They were knocking on doors to make sure that people were fed. There were all kinds of ways that people were invited in. And so I like to hear this idea of following in these ordinances. I do not turn away from your ordinances, I might say to the holy. I might not do it exactly the way other people do. In fact, I might feel like I'm doing it every day. If indeed we believe that baptism is for everyone, and it's just a recognition of something God has already done, if we believe that baptism is about someone's awareness of being beloved, awareness of belonging, awareness of not having a separation with the holy, then I can make that happen every day when I interact with people. Even with people who might see things differently than I do. I can find ways to be that kind of a presence, to follow in that ordinance of God that God taught me, that Jesus showed me, and that the Spirit continually equips me to be able to do. And similarly with communion, if I believe that this table is for everyone, if I believe that there's more than enough for all of us, if I believe that this is a setting for nurture and for us to come alongside each other and tell our stories and shed our tears and lean on each other and encourage each other, then I have to do that out in the world too, in ways that are real, in ways that can be received, not just in ways I think they should be, but that flexibility piece comes again, and that idea that I am needing to be present to the other in ways that they can receive, in ways that they can hear, in ways that they can see, in ways that they can understand. That can be hard work. And so this story in the gospel that James read for us also reminds us that there is that persistence, that we have to do it over and over again, that we might not be doing it alone, that hopefully we find partners to share a bit of that, because we cannot always be engaged in it. And so we need to organize, and we need to advocate, and we need to push and encourage. We need to be consistent in our messaging, even if it shifts a little bit in the words that we use and in the places that we go. Over and over again, we are told that we must live our faith, not just speak about it. That we need to be faithful people in this moment. In every age, at every age, we are encouraged to be faithful people. The other night I was talking to a colleague of mine who's Roman Catholic, and I said something about the American Pope, and he said, U.S. American Pope. This particular colleague of mine is from South America, and he wants to always remind me, and sometimes I forget, that the Pope is U.S. American. You can't just say the American Pope. But I was talking about how I feel like he is a U.S. American Pope for such a time as this, hearkening back to Esther in the Hebrew Bible. Esther, who didn't really know what she was supposed to do, and she was given this responsibility to speak up for her people, and she was afraid, and she was young, and she was new. But she was told that, Esther, maybe you're in this spot right now for such a time as this. Maybe nobody else can do this right now in the way that you can. And so I'm reminded, for such a time as this, maybe that's why the U.S. American Pope continues to speak out and to tell people in America to use our voices strongly, to be persistent and consistent, to be compassionate and welcoming. And I was mentioning this to my Catholic friend who said, I appreciate that this Pope is preaching the gospel, and that we're all called to preach the gospel. From whatever lens, whatever history, whatever privilege or power we have been given within Christianity. And then he told me a story about the cancellation of U.S. Army contracts in the chaplaincy program. Maybe you've read about it, that there's been the cancellation of some U.S. Army contracts in the chaplaincy program. It has nothing to do with the government's inability to stay open. These are cuts that are being made separately. And what it is doing is taking apart the chaplain's abilities to serve people. There are musicians in the chaplaincy who are no longer employed. There are people who are educators. There are people who are assisting chaplains that suddenly are no longer there. And so it's making it a lot more difficult for chaplains to serve people in this time of unrest. And he told me that approximately 6 Protestant chaplains are there in the army for every 1,000 Protestants, 6 to every 1. And Catholic chaplains, there's 1 for every 1,000. And so the Catholic chaplains are really feeling the crunch of not having the support that they need as educators and musicians and support staff have been eliminated. And so as he was reminding me that we need to be persistent for each other. We need to show up for each other. We need to speak our story and speak our truth to help others recognize where we need to do better, where we need to show up for each other, where we need to be more committed to each other. So maybe the person knocking at the door needs you to spell them for a minute. Maybe they need you to bring them some water or some nourishment. Maybe they need you to take their place for a while. Maybe they need to know that they're not alone there doing that knocking, that they need to be surrounded and encouraged and in solidarity with others. Please pray with us. Holy One, we are the ones knocking at the door, and we are the ones on the other side. We are the ones setting structure and institutions and ordinances and laws and decrees. And we are the ones breathing new life into everything and finding ways, old and new, tried and risky, to live out the call that you give us day in, day out, and overnight. And so help us to be the love that is needed in the world. Help us to find ways to translate your love into belonging and into welcome and into hospitality and nurture, into making room at the table, into knowing that we are lifting up the reality of your presence and your love, that there's nothing that we're doing that isn't already you. And so equip us, help us to be persistent, help us to be flexible, help us to be vulnerable and available to do your work. For when we pay attention, we know that we love your ordinances. We love the way that you have invited us to be a part of your ways, of your wisdom, of your love. Amen.